Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. We're talking about it. What's up, FellowPhantoms? How you doing? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're talking about Quentin Tarantino's 9th film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So if you haven't seen any marketing material, you just don't know what this movie is about. Essentially, this movie stars Leonardo DiCaprio, Brad Pitt, Margot Robbie, among others. There's a lot of people that have multiple cameos. Al Pacino's in this, Dakota Fanning, just a bunch of people that might not have the best screen time, but they're in it. But essentially, this movie is mainly Brad Pitt, Leonardo DiCaprio, and those two play essentially somebody that used to be a star in the golden age of Hollywood. And by the way, this movie takes place in 1969, if you didn't already know that. So Leonardo DiCaprio, as I said before, plays Rick Dalton, which is somebody that used to be big in the heyday of Hollywood and now is kind of in the twilight of his career, as you see him here. Brad Pitt plays Cliff Booth, which is his stuntman slash best friend slash driver, and that's basically who you see for the majority of this movie. Now, Margot Robbie does play Sharon Tate. If you don't know already, Sharon Tate was somebody that was also an actress, not a huge actress, but she was married to Roman Polanski during this time. Unfortunately, in real history, not in this movie, she was killed along with other people by the Manson family and their followers. So this movie kind of pays homage to her as a character, but doesn't really give her too much screen time. But again, without going too much of a tangent, the movie is mainly Cliff Booth and Rick Dalton. So as I said before, this is Quentin Tarantino's 9th movie, and it is a little slow. And by slow, I mean most of the movie is conversations between the various characters, kind of just the nuanced feeling of what it is to be in that era. This really is a movie of that era. It's a love letter to 1969, to the late 60s, and just TV and movie and just the culture around that industry. You see Rick Dalton struggling with who he was as an actor and what Hollywood is becoming now and how he adapts to that. But Leonardo DiCaprio does really good. Margot Robbie does good in the screen time again that she's given. While I guess, like I said before, Leonardo DiCaprio does a very good job, Brad Pitt really steals the show. He's kind of this cool, calm, collected. At this point, he's basically playing Brad Pitt, but in the 1960s as a stuntman or former stuntman, however you want to look at it. He does an amazing job. He's the most, in my opinion, he's the most likable, charismatic character, even though there's some mystery as to who he is as a person behind what's given in front of you. But it is a tad long. I think it's about 2 hours and 40 minutes, which is, I mean, that's a long time for a movie that it's not endgame. There's no constant action, constant humor, and that's really what this movie is not trying to be, though. This is not a movie of this era, I guess, and I think that's what Tarantino tries to do. Most of his movies don't belong in the era that they're made in. If you go back and look at Pulp Fiction and Kill Bill, those movies don't really belong in the 90s. Those movies almost look like they were made for today's era. And I think this movie, if you look in maybe 15-20 years, is going to be more belonging, more suitable in that era, maybe. I don't know. I can't predict the future. I don't know what movies will be like in the future, but it is not of this time. It is almost of a 60s nature, and you do get like a very, very good insight into how TV and movies were made, you know, during that period. There's a super cool scene where Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio, they just come home. They're like, hey, you're gonna stay and watch, you know, my episode with me? He's like, yeah, I got a 6-pack right here. And they literally, like, you just see the screen of whatever TV show he's on, and they just watch the show and kind of like give a commentary, like a very funny commentary of like something like you would do with your friends if you've seen something before. They're like, oh yeah, I shot that guy, or like, oh here comes Rick Dalton, and it's just, it's a cool commentary, and it's funny that like you could get an audience to sit down and watch somebody else do a commentary of a show, a character that doesn't exist. That's what Tarantino does with his humor and just his atmosphere and the characters and actors that he got to portray these characters. Super cool scene, and definitely the last 30 minutes. If the first 2 hours are boring to you in any way, if you manage to sit down and sit through all that, if that's not something you did like, I did appreciate it, but if that's not something you like, the last 30 minutes will have you saying, okay, that was worth it, because it's definitely like an amazing payoff to something that was like alluded to and set up through throughout the movie. Something that I kind of mentioned in the beginning when it comes to Sharon Tate. Again, I told you, she was murdered by the Manson family. A lot of people going into this movie maybe suspect that, Charles Manson has a big part to play in this movie, and he really doesn't. And I don't really give too much away, but the parts that do involve Manson, or at least the Manson family and the Spawn Ranch, which is where they used to make 60s westerns. That's kind of where, if you look at history, that's where the Manson family resided. They spent most of their time, that's where they lived. When they go to that part of the movie, that's actually a really, really cool setup, and it gives you a cool, insight into who the Manson family were, how they operated, the kind of people that were involved in it, which is super cool, and just the tension and the feeling and the atmosphere around that. It didn't give too much power, basically, to the Manson family. And I think that's good, because when you're looking back, you don't want to give that kind of power to a family or a group of people that did that kind of evil. It gave just the right amount of humor into something that probably didn't happen, but the right amount of tension into who these people were, why they did what they did, and just the mindset that they were in and the atmosphere that they created. I thought that was a super cool insight into the Manson family if you weren't, completely aware of who they were as a people and why they did what they did. I mean, it doesn't give you a word-for-word basis and an explanation for that, but I think it's a super cool insight into, who they were. They weren't just, they were murderers, of course, but it tells you who they were at the time in the era that they were in, which is cool. I said cool 25 million times. You're welcome. Anyways, guys, I really appreciated the movie. I really, really enjoyed it. I would go and see it again, even though it's such a long movie. But again, if dialogue-driven movies were a lot of conversation and character building and just insight into who these people are and where they're at, and if you're not a fan of, the 60s era in general, or at least the end of the 60s, you might not like this movie. It's not your typical Kill Bill, Django Unchained. It's not that kind of Tarantino movie. But it's still a very, very enjoyable movie, and the last 20 minutes, in my opinion, are really, really just a fun ride, and it had literally everybody in the audience just either laughing or clapping or just in awe of what was happening on screen. Definitely check it out. So, fellow Phantoms, I'm going to give this movie an A. It does have its issues. There's sometimes when it's just boring. There's sometimes where a scene probably goes on for too long. But again, this is Tarantino's just love letter to the era. And just the film industry in Hollywood. He just paints a great picture of the 1960s Hollywood and the actors and people in the industry and how they were portrayed in that time. Whether that was good or bad, I think he does a very good job of that. Does a very good job in how much screen time and the tension that the Manson family provide. It was just a great film. I enjoyed it. I think you should too. I give it an A. Anyways, fellow Phantoms, I appreciate you guys stopping by. If you guys have any movies coming out soon or in the past or currently out you want me to take a look at, go ahead and put those in the comments below. If you're not subscribed already, please hit subscribe, hit the like button, hit the bell so you know every time I'm coming out with new video reviews, and I just appreciate you guys stopping by. Thank you. I'll see you guys in the next video. Later.